A ruined former millionaire, drowning in guilt and on the edge of collapse, lived in isolation inside a forgotten restaurant. But his bleak routine changes when a little girl appears, carrying evidence of a covered-up billion-dollar theft. What seemed like childish nonsense reveals a scheme that destroyed his life and cost $370 million. What they do together is astonishing. The rain hammered against the grimy windows of Murphy's Diner on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, each droplet a reminder of how far Robert "Bobby" Sterling had fallen. Once, those same raindrops would have cascaded down the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 42nd floor office overlooking Central Park, where he commanded billions and shaped markets with a single phone call. Now they mocked him through cracked glass as he sat hunched over a lukewarm cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Bobby Sterling. The name that once opened doors across Wall Street now whispered only in hushed tones of scandal and ruin. 3 years ago, he had been the golden boy of high finance, the mastermind behind Sterling Capital Management, a hedge fund that promised impossible returns and somehow delivered them year after year. His algorithm, a proprietary risk management system he had developed during his MIT days, had been his secret weapon, turning modest investments into fortunes and making him a legend among his peers. Then came the collapse. Overnight, everything crumbled. The fund hemorrhaged money at an unprecedented rate, wiping out not just wealthy investors but pension funds, college endowments, and the life savings of ordinary people who had trusted him with their futures. The SEC investigation that followed painted him as either grossly incompetent or willfully negligent. His business partner, Marcus Rothwell, had testified against him, claiming Bobby had made reckless decisions against all advice. The media devoured the story, dubbing him the Wall Street Icarus who flew too close to the sun. His wife, Patricia, had left him before the dust settled, taking their house in the Hamptons and their shared social circle with her. His friends vanished like morning mist, and his professional licenses were stripped away. The man who once managed $12 billion now counted quarters to buy a decent meal. Murphy's Diner had become his sanctuary, if you could call it that. The owner, a gruff Irish immigrant named Sean Murphy, didn't care about fallen Wall Street titans. As long as Bobby paid for his coffee and didn't bother the other customers, he was welcome to sit in the corner booth and nurse his regrets. The other patrons were mostly shift workers, cab drivers, and late-night wanderers, people who had their own problems and no interest in his. Bobby stared at his reflection in the coffee's dark surface, seeing a stranger. His once pristine appearance had given way to stubble, rumpled clothes from a thrift store, and eyes that had lost their fire. At 52, he felt ancient, hollowed out by shame and the weight of thousands of accusations. He had replayed the collapse countless times in his mind, searching for the moment it all went wrong, but the numbers never made sense. His algorithm had been tested, retested, and refined over years. It shouldn't have failed so catastrophically. The door chime announced another customer, but Bobby didn't look up. He had learned to ignore the world around him, to exist in his bubble of self-imposed exile. But something made him glance toward the entrance, perhaps the unusual silence that followed the chime. Standing in the doorway was a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. She was soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her head, and her small sneakers squelched with each step she took across the linoleum floor. What struck Bobby most was her eyes, large and intelligent, scanning the diner with the intensity of someone twice her age. In her arms, she clutched an old composition notebook, holding it protectively against her chest as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Sean Murphy emerged from behind the counter, his expression softening at the sight of the child. "Hey there, sweetheart, are you okay? Where are your parents?" The girl ignored him completely, her gaze fixed on Bobby. She walked directly to his booth, her wet shoes leaving a trail across the floor, and slid into the seat across from him without invitation. Up close, Bobby could see that despite her bedraggled appearance, there was something remarkable about her. Her eyes held a maturity that seemed impossible for someone so young, and the way she set the notebook on the table suggested it was precious beyond measure. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and unwavering despite her obvious exhaustion, My name is Emma Chen, and I've been looking for you for a very long time." Bobby nearly choked on his coffee. No one had called him Mr. Sterling in years, and certainly not with the respect this child seemed to convey. He set down his cup with shaking hands, his mind racing. How did this little girl know who he was? And why wasn't she afraid of him like everyone else? "I think you have me confused with someone else," he said quietly, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. The last thing he needed was to be accused of some inappropriate contact with a minor. "I'm nobody special." Emma opened the notebook, revealing pages covered in neat handwriting, mathematical equations and financial calculations that made Bobby's breath catch in his throat. The formulas looked familiar, eerily so, like echoes of his own work, but with subtle differences that made his skin crawl. "You're Robert Sterling, former CEO of Sterling Capital Management," Emma continued, her small finger tracing one of the equations. "You developed the Prometheus algorithm for risk assessment and portfolio optimization. Your fund collapsed on September 15th, 3 years ago, causing losses of $8.7 billion. The precision of her knowledge hit Bobby like a physical blow. Those weren't the kind of details a child would know or care about. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My mother was Sarah Chen," Emma said, and something in her voice shifted, becoming vulnerable for the first time. "She was an accountant. She put all our money in your fund because she believed you were an honest man. When everything went wrong, she lost her job, our apartment, everything we had." Bobby felt the familiar stab of guilt that had become his constant companion. Another life destroyed by his failures, another family torn apart. He started to speak, to offer the empty apologies he had rehearsed thousands of times, but Emma held up her small hand to stop him. "But she didn't blame you," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. "She kept studying your algorithm, kept looking at the patterns in the trades. She said the numbers didn't make sense, that something was wrong with the math. She found things, Mr. Sterling, things that prove you didn't cause the collapse." Bobby's world tilted on its axis. For 3 years he had accepted the blame, internalized the guilt, and assumed his own incompetence had destroyed so many lives. The idea that he might not be responsible felt both impossible and terrifying. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, a cruel joke that would only lead to more disappointment. "That's impossible," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The investigation was thorough, the evidence was clear. I made mistakes, took risks I shouldn't have taken." Emma shook her head firmly, opening the notebook to a page covered with timestamps and trading records. "Look at this. These are the execution times for major trades in the weeks before the collapse. Do you see the pattern?" Despite himself, Bobby found his eyes drawn to the neat columns of numbers. His mind, trained by decades of financial analysis, began processing the data automatically. There was something there, a rhythmic pattern in the execution times that seemed almost mechanical in its precision. Every major trade was executed exactly 47 seconds after the algorithm signaled, Emma explained, her finger moving down the column. "But your original Prometheus algorithm was designed with random delays between 5 and 90 seconds to prevent market manipulation detection. This fixed timing shouldn't exist." Bobby's hands trembled as he reached for the notebook, his analytical mind wrestling with the implications. If what Emma was showing him was true, if someone had modified his algorithm to create this pattern, then everything he thought he knew about the collapse was wrong. "Where did your mother get this information?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She worked for the compliance department at Meridian Cloud Services, the company that hosted your trading systems. When she noticed the irregularities, she started copying data before it was archived. She was going to take it to the authorities, but then she got scared. She said someone was watching her, following her. She hid all her research in this notebook and told me to keep it safe, that someday I might need to show it to the right person." Emma's voice caught slightly on the last words, and Bobby realized the depth of courage it must have taken for this little girl to track him down. He thought about Sarah Chen, a woman he had never met, but whose life he had inadvertently destroyed, working late nights to uncover a truth that might clear his name. "What happened to your mother?" he asked gently, though he feared the answer. She got very sad after she lost her job, Emma said quietly. She couldn't find work anywhere because of the scandal. The stress made her sick, and one night she just gave up. But before she went to the hospital, she made me promise to find you and show you what she discovered. She said you deserved to know the truth even if it was too late to fix everything. Bobby felt tears he hadn't shed in years threatening to spill. This little girl had lost everything because of his supposed failures, yet she was here trying to help him. The irony was almost too much to bear. He looked down at the notebook again, at the careful handwriting and meticulous calculations that represented one woman's determination to find the truth. Even if this is real, he said slowly, even if someone did manipulate my algorithm, it's too late now. The investigation is closed. Everyone has moved on. I'm just a cautionary tale now. Emma's eyes flashed with the same intensity he had noticed when she first entered the diner. That's not true, Mr. Sterling. Numbers don't lie and they don't expire. If someone stole your algorithm and used it to destroy your company, then they're still out there. They probably got rich while you took the blame. Don't you want to stop them? The simple question cut through years of self-pity and resignation. Did he want to stop them? For 3 years, Bobby had accepted his fate, convinced that he deserved his downfall. But sitting across from this remarkable little girl, looking at evidence that suggested his innocence, he felt something he hadn't experienced in ages, the stirring of purpose. Sean Murphy appeared at their table with a towel and a concerned expression. "Miss, you're soaking wet. Can I call someone for you? Your parents must be worried sick." Emma looked up at him with those unnaturally mature eyes. "I don't have anyone to call, sir, but I'm exactly where I need to be." Bobby made a decision that would change both their lives. He closed the notebook carefully and slid it back toward Emma. "If we're going to do this," he said quietly, "we need to be very careful. If your mother was right, if someone really did sabotage my company, then they have a lot to lose if we expose them. Are you sure you want to take that risk?" Emma nodded without hesitation. "My mom always said that the truth is worth fighting for, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." As the rain continued to pound against the windows of Murphy's diner, Bobby Sterling felt something he thought was gone forever: hope. It was fragile and frightening, but it was real. This extraordinary little girl had walked into his life carrying proof that might vindicate him, and more importantly, she believed in his innocence when no one else would. The road ahead would be dangerous and uncertain, but for the first time in 3 years, Bobby Sterling had a reason to fight back. The man who had lost everything was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful allies come in the smallest packages, and that redemption often begins with a single act of faith from an unexpected source. 2 weeks had passed since that rainy night when Emma Chen walked into Bobby Sterling's life, and the small room above Murphy's diner had been transformed into an unlikely command center. The Irish proprietor had taken pity on them, offering the cramped storage space as temporary accommodation, in exchange for Bobby helping with the books and Emma charming the regular customers with her precocious intelligence. Every surface was covered with printouts, financial documents, and Emma's mother's meticulous notes. Bobby had managed to contact a few former colleagues who still believed in his innocence, and slowly pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The fixed 47-second delay wasn't the only irregularity Emma's mother had discovered. Hidden within the algorithm's code were subtle modifications that had turned his risk management system into a weapon of financial destruction. "Mr. Sterling, look at this," Emma said, sitting cross-legged on the floor with the laptop Bobby had managed to borrow. Her small fingers moved across the keyboard with surprising skill as she pulled up trading records from the days leading up to the collapse. "I've been comparing the backup codes my Uncle David found with your original algorithm." David Chen, Sarah's brother, had been their breakthrough. When Bobby finally worked up the courage to approach the IT technician at Meridian Cloud Services, the man's grief over his sister's decline had initially made him hostile. His eyes had blazed with anger when Bobby first introduced himself, years of suppressed rage erupting in accusations and bitter words. "You destroyed my sister's life," David had said, his voice trembling with emotion. "She believed in you, trusted you with everything we had saved for years. When your fund collapsed, she blamed herself for not seeing the signs. The guilt ate her alive." But Emma's presence had gradually worn down his resistance. Watching his 9-year-old niece speak with such conviction about patterns and algorithms, seeing her unwavering belief in Bobby's innocence, had planted seeds of doubt about the official narrative. David's access to the cloud servers had provided them with the smoking gun they needed, though he risked his job and potentially his freedom by retrieving the archived data. The modifications weren't random, Emma continued, her voice filled with the excitement of discovery. Someone knew exactly how to make your system fail. They didn't just change the timing delays. They inverted your risk parameters, so every time the algorithm should have pulled back from a risky trade, it doubled down instead. Bobby leaned over her shoulder, studying the code comparison on the screen. The elegance of the sabotage was breathtaking in its maliciousness. Every line of corrupted code was a dagger aimed at his life's work. Whoever had done this understood his system better than anyone except himself. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Only one person had this level of access to the core algorithm, he whispered, sinking into the rickety chair beside Emma. Marcus Rothwell. His former business partner's name hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus, who had been his closest friend since their Harvard days, who had stood as best man at his wedding, who had stood by his side as they built Sterling Capital from a 2-room office into a financial powerhouse, who had ultimately testified against him when everything fell apart. And the betrayal cut deeper than the financial ruin, deeper than the public humiliation, deeper than losing his wife and home. Emma looked up at him with those impossibly wise eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone so young. He was your business partner, right? The one who took over after you were forced out? Not just took over, Bobby said bitterly, his hands clenching into fists. He built his own empire on the ruins of mine. Rothwell Financial is now one of the biggest hedge funds on Wall Street. Marcus positioned himself as the voice of reason, the responsible partner who tried to stop my reckless behavior. The media loved him for it. He gave interviews about the importance of ethical leadership while standing on the graves of our investors' dreams. The investigation had consumed every waking moment for weeks, but they were careful to vary their routine, knowing that powerful people had strong motivations to keep the truth buried. Emma had proven surprisingly adept at reconnaissance, her innocent appearance allowing her to observe and listen without suspicion. She had noticed the same black sedan parked across from the diner on 3 different days, always with the same driver, who pretended to read newspapers while watching their building. David had reported receiving anonymous offers to purchase his silence, increasingly generous amounts deposited into untraceable cryptocurrency wallets with accompanying messages about the benefits of forgetting the past. "We need legal proof," Bobby said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Everything we found was obtained through David's unauthorized access to Meridian's servers. No court would accept it as evidence, and Marcus has enough lawyers to bury us in technicalities for decades. "What about Ms. Rodriguez?" Emma suggested, looking up from her notebook where she had been sketching mathematical formulas. "You said she was the compliance director at your company before the collapse. If she was good at her job, she would have noticed something was wrong." Carmen Rodriguez had been Sterling Capital's director of regulatory compliance, a meticulous woman who had built her career on ethical investing and transparency. She was known throughout the industry for her integrity, someone who would rather lose a client than bend the rules. She had been terminated immediately after the collapse, ostensibly as part of the general house cleaning, but Bobby had always suspected she knew more than she had been allowed to. Say during the investigation, finding Carmen had taken days of careful searching through professional networks and industry contacts, but when they finally located her working as a consultant for a small investment firm in Brooklyn, her reaction to seeing Bobby was electric. The composed professional facade cracked like ice in spring, revealing years of suppressed anger, guilt, and frustration. "I knew something was wrong," she admitted during their clandestine meeting in a quiet coffee shop in Park Slope, her voice barely above a whisper. "The reports Marcus submitted during the final weeks didn't match the data I was seeing from the trading desk. The risk profiles were completely inverted from our established protocols. When I tried to raise concerns, he said you had authorized special protocols that were above my clearance level." Carmen's hands shook as she stirred her coffee, the memories clearly painful. I should have pushed harder, should have demanded to speak with you directly. But Marcus was so convincing, so authoritative. He said you were under tremendous stress and had made some aggressive decisions to try to salvage the fund. He even showed me documents with your signature, authorizing the changes. Bobby felt sick to his stomach. I never signed any such authorizations. I was in the hospital for 3 days having my appendix removed, and Marcus assured me he would handle everything according to our standard procedures. Carmen had been afraid to speak out after the collapse, convinced that challenging the official narrative would destroy what remained of her career in an industry that valued loyalty over truth. But she had kept records, a meticulous insurance policy that detailed discrepancies in trading authorizations, backdated documents, and communication logs that showed Marcus's increasing control over the algorithm in Bobby's absence. I have emails where Marcus specifically instructed the IT team to implement enhanced automation protocols for the Prometheus system, Carmen revealed, sliding a flash drive across the table with trembling fingers. I also have the original signed partnership agreements showing that any modifications to the core algorithm required both partners' written approval, something Marcus clearly circumvented. I kept copies of everything because something felt wrong from the very beginning. With Carmen's evidence and David's technical data, they finally had a legitimate case that could stand up in court, but presenting it would require careful timing and maximum impact. Bobby knew that Marcus would use every resource at his disposal to discredit their findings and destroy their credibility. The man had billions of dollars and an army of lawyers, public relations specialists, and political connections at his command. The press conference was held at the offices of Margaret Walsh, a crusading financial journalist who had covered the original collapse and always suspected there was more to the story. She had been one of the few reporters to question the neat narrative that painted Bobby as the sole villain, and her investigative instincts had kept her digging even when the story had moved out of the headlines. When Bobby walked into the conference room at the Financial Tribune's Manhattan headquarters, flanked by Emma and Carmen, the assembled reporters buzzed with curiosity and skepticism. Many recognized him from the endless photographs that had accompanied his public downfall, but now he looked different. The broken man who had slunk away in shame 3 years earlier had been replaced by someone with purpose, someone with fire in his eyes again. 3 years ago, Sterling Capital Management collapsed, destroying billions in investor funds and ruining thousands of lives. Bobby began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I accepted full responsibility for that disaster because I believed I had failed in my duties as CEO and fiduciary. I was wrong. The presentation that followed was methodical and devastating. Carmen presented the documentary evidence of unauthorized algorithm modifications, walking the reporters through a paper trail of deception that stretched back months before the collapse. David, participating via secure video link from an undisclosed location, explained the technical aspects of how the sabotage had been implemented, using visual aids to show exactly how the code had been corrupted. And Emma, speaking with a clarity that belied her 9 years, described how her mother's careful investigation had uncovered the patterns that everyone else had missed. She stood on a small platform behind the podium, her voice carrying across the packed room as she explained complex financial concepts with the passion of someone who had lived with these numbers for months. "My mom always said that numbers don't lie, but people do," Emma said, holding up her mother's notebook for the cameras. She found the truth because she cared more about what was right than what was easy. Mr. Sterling lost everything because someone he trusted betrayed that trust. But the truth was always there, waiting for someone brave enough to look for it. The climax came when they revealed the smoking gun, an email thread recovered from Marcus's personal account through Carmen's compliance access. In it, Marcus discussed his plans to restructure the partnership and eliminate Bobby as a liability to the firm's growth potential. The emails detailed how he had used Bobby's temporary medical leave following his appendectomy to implement the algorithm changes, knowing that by the time Bobby returned, the damage would be irreversible and the blame would fall squarely on his shoulders. "Marcus Rothwell didn't just steal my company," Bobby concluded, his voice thick with emotion as he looked directly into the cameras. He destroyed it from within, then built his empire on the ashes of thousands of innocent people's financial futures. He let me take the blame for his crimes while he profited from the chaos he created. Today, we're asking the authorities to reopen the investigation and hold the real perpetrator accountable for his actions. The media explosion was immediate and intense. Within hours, Rothwell Financial's stock price had plummeted by 30%, and federal investigators were issuing subpoenas for records that had been sealed for years. Marcus, who had fled to Switzerland when rumors of the press conference began circulating through financial circles, found himself persona non grata in the international financial community as banks and investors distanced themselves from the growing scandal. The legal proceedings that followed vindicated everything Emma's mother had discovered in her lonely quest for truth. The modified algorithm was proven to be the direct cause of the collapse, and Marcus's manipulation was demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt through forensic analysis of the code and testimony from former employees who had been afraid to speak out earlier. When he finally returned to face charges, the courtroom was packed with former Sterling Capital investors who had lost everything in the collapse. Many were elderly people who had trusted their retirement savings to Bobby's fund. Others were young families whose college savings had evaporated overnight. They watched with a mixture of vindication and sadness as the truth finally came to light. The trial's most powerful moment came when Emma took the witness stand. Now 10 years old, but still small for her age, she described her mother's dedication to uncovering the truth with such precision and emotional honesty that several jurors wiped away tears. Her testimony, combined with the overwhelming technical evidence, led to Marcus's conviction on multiple counts of securities fraud, conspiracy, and fiduciary breach. Bobby's exoneration was complete and public. The SEC formally cleared him of any wrongdoing, his professional licenses were restored, and a substantial settlement from Rothwell Financial's seized assets provided compensation for the victims. But more importantly than any financial restitution, his reputation was rebuilt on a foundation of truth and justice. 1 year later, Bobby stood in the gleaming offices of Sterling Chen Foundation, the non-profit organization he and Emma had created to support gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Emma, now officially his adopted daughter, through a legal process that had brought tears to both their eyes, worked beside him with the same intensity she had brought to solving his case. Carmen had joined as their compliance director, ensuring that their grant-making process was transparent and ethical. David had become their chief technology officer, using his skills to create secure financial systems for other non-profits. Murphy's Diner remained their favorite place for Sunday breakfast, a weekly tradition that reminded them of where their unlikely partnership had begun. Sean Murphy had used his modest reward from the foundation to renovate the restaurant, creating a community space where people struggling with financial hardship could find support and guidance. Emma kept her mother's notebook in a place of honor on her desk, its pages now protected by a custom frame that preserved every carefully written equation and observation. The neat handwriting and mathematical formulas served as a daily reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find a way to surface through determination and courage. "The numbers never lie," Emma often said when interviewed about their journey, her mother's favorite phrase carrying new weight and meaning. "Sometimes they whisper, and you have to listen very carefully, but they're always trying to tell you something important if you care enough to hear them." Bobby had learned that redemption comes not from forgetting the past, but from transforming pain into purpose. He had lost everything material and gained something infinitely more valuable, a daughter who had taught him that hope could be found in the darkest places, and that the most powerful force in the world was an unwavering belief in the truth and the courage to fight for it.